for all of you folks who are out there for the March members meeting of the Harry Dale Hartley Conservation Area, thank you very much for coming in. Our guest tonight will be Dwayne Shaw, Executive Director of the Downeast Salmon Federation. We're going to wait a few minutes and let a few more people sign in. And once we've got a decent number, we will go ahead and start the meeting. But I will jump the gun and say, good evening, Dwayne. It's great to see you.
Good to see you too. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for being willing to take the time. You've been a busy man this past winter.
We have been busy, and we're busy tonight too. We just set, I don't know how many 100 feet of smelt net, and we'll be tending them this evening. So this is just the beginning of the evening.
How late will you be up?
1 o'clock probably.
Oh man.
Tomorrow's tide will be an hour later, and we'll be 2 o'clock. But smelts come when they come.
Well, in recognition of the fact that you're going to be working past midnight, I guess we better begin and let you go ahead and meet with us, so you've got at least a little bit of time to yourself later this evening. I do want to let everyone know a little bit about you, Dwayne, because your record of accomplishments so far is pretty damn impressive. And I think everybody needs to know that in addition to you being the executive director of the Downeast Salmon Federation, and the fact that you've led that organization since 1989, which is quite a track record, I think, that in 2000, you were at the center of the removal of the East Machias River Dam, and that you actually got an award from President George W. Bush for that particular accomplishment. So that's pretty impressive. And it's now, if I understand it rightly, the home of your DSF hatchery. Is that correct?
One of our hatcheries, yes.
Sounds like a great way to repurpose a former dam. That's great.
Yeah.
And I'd like to turn the rest of the meeting over to you. I think I neglected to ask whether you would like questions during your presentation or at the end. And I know you'd like to share our screen so that you can show us some material while you talk.
Sure. Yeah, I think we could go forward with questions at the end. I'll try to go through a few slides. I was trying to oh, there's an echo.
Don't.
Is that
Are you coming through now?
Yeah, I don't hear the echo now. Can you hear me?
All right, yes, you're coming through fine on our side.
Okay, good. Well, I do have some slides that I can show, and I have one in particular that I want to start with. But before we get going, I just again thank you all for the work that you're doing there, Belfast area. It's an important area, of course. And the Little River needs attention, needs help, the fisheries in particular. So the ecosystem there is interrupted, as I think you all know, because of a couple of dams. No doubt there are other things going on as well. We get involved with all manner of projects related to fish recovery, whether it's acid rain related research or action to culverts and fish, education work, research, enumeration of fish such that they can be harvested, so we know that there's a sustainable population. So we have a lot of different things going on. Just by way of an introduction to the organization, the Downeast Salmon Federation got started in 1982 in Washington County, and it was started by salmon anglers and and other anglers as we realized that the salmon were really being neglected, the other sea-run fish, and there's a dozen sea-run fish in our ecosystem. Two were being essentially neglected. So it became a quote federation, and that was 5 different angling clubs in Washington County. And that's from the Denny's River, the East Machias, the Pleasant, and Narraguagus each had organizations, and together they formed the federation. And one of the very first projects that they jumped on was removal of a dam, and I'm sitting at that site right now in Columbia Falls on the Pleasant River, and I have 130,000 salmon eggs underneath in the old power plant. I can hear the pumps going right now. So we took the dam out. In that case, we worked with partners. It wasn't just us, but and then we took a lease on the property from the state of Maine. So we have 12 employees and 2 hatcheries, and we have offices associated with 3 different dams. There's the East Machias, this one here in Columbia Falls on the Pleasant, and then on the Orange River in Whiting, which is the Passamaquoddies call it the Cobscook River. It drains. It's one of the bigger rivers draining into Cobscook Bay. And a few years ago, we purchased property there, really for the dam, but it came with an old house, and we've since worked with Maine Coast Heritage Trust and renovated that house, and it's now an outreach center and an office. No hatchery over there yet. That dam's not being removed. There's going to be a brand new fishway put in it, so the dam's going to be, in that case, rebuilt and state-of-the-art fishway put in. So we also operate a land trust. We've conserved 6,000 acres and about 40 plus miles of river and stream frontage and lake frontage in the process. So the buffers along the rivers are important for shade and filtering pollutants and those types of things, putting bugs into the stream that the fish can eat. So that land trust has been in operation since about the time the Atlantic salmon got listed as an endangered species around 2000. So the Atlantic salmon, which is of course built into our name, and many people hear about Atlantic salmon, is now an endangered species. It has been for about 20 years. And the other sea-run fish, which I'll show you a picture here in a moment of the other sea-run fish, many of them are also in pretty dire straits. However, the theme of my talk tonight is not all is lost. Humpty Dumpty, the rivers that have been broken, our ecosystems are broken largely in various ways, can be put together again, and we've proven that. But it takes a lot to do it. Some of the fish, like the alewives, will rebound pretty quickly. Atlantic salmon are a different creature altogether, and they migrate much further, and so there's a lot of different specifics about each fish species. So if I can share screen, and I'll hit this button here, and let's see. Well, actually, let's hit that and see if that pops up.
I think we have to give him permission, don't we? Yeah.
Okay.
Well, let me make sure you got it.
Let me try share and see what happens. There. Can you see that?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So what you see pictured here is artist's rendition of all these 12 species that inhabit or historically inhabited the rivers of this region. So you're familiar with the name of the river, Passagasawake, down near you all. That was the place to spear sturgeon at night. is what that means. And sturgeon are present.
Yeah, they're prehistoric.
And you'll see these fish. There's like two species of sturgeon, and all the species that you see here have to. They're hardwired to migrate between the freshwater and the saltwater. They must do that to fulfill their life cycle. So, in the case of the American eel, bottom left there, they do the reverse. All the others come into freshwater spawn. The American eel goes to the ocean to spawn, and it takes about 20 years for an American eel to mature in freshwater before they do that big migration down to Sargasso Sea. The others that you see here, and I'll just read off the names: American shad, alewife, blueback herring, tomcod, eastern brook trout, sea lamprey, rainbow smelt, striped bass, Atlantic salmon, Atlantic sturgeon, short-nosed sturgeon, and then the American eel. That's what we call the diadromous suite. So it's a suite of species that inhabit our rivers, ponds, lakes, and the freshwater side, and then the oceans, and they go to various places in the ocean, and then, of course, return to those rivers again in order to spawn. So in your case, Little River, the eastern brook trout is present. They're present above the dams, and there are native populations of those. They may be stocking up there as well. I'm not sure, but I know that there are native brook trout there. They wouldn't be sea run brook trout because they can't get there anymore. So below the dam, however, you may have fish that are brook trout that are still coming in right up under Route 1, and I'd be very surprised if they aren't. So those fish would have either dropped out and went over the dam, or they would have migrated in from a nearby stream that has open access to the ocean. Some of these other species, you may still have rainbow smelt because they can spawn in that small area just above the head of tide or right in the tidewater area. And the tomcod will do that as well. But the rest of these really, except for the sturgeon, striped bass can spawn typically in larger habitats. But the point of all of this is to fulfill their life cycle completely. They need to be able to do this upstream migration into the freshwater at will. So we call it volitional fish passage. When they're ready, they need to be able to go. And sometimes what they're attempting to do is to avoid a flood or avoid a drought or a particular hot spell, and they need to get into their maybe spring holes where they would go. So there's a lot involved with dams and water quality, fisheries management, catch limits, and various things that get put in place in order to conserve and in some cases restore populations. But first and foremost is, as they say, they've got to get there from here. So if the river is completely bunged up, as somebody might say, it's plugged and they can't get there, it's over. And some species will recolonize on their own, build it or unbuild it, and they will come. So, or you could jumpstart the population if you need to by bringing fish in from a nearby location, or potentially having a hatchery where you would stock the fish from. So there are some species that are known to recolonize quickly and pretty readily, and alewife are an example of that. The alewife and the bluebacks are often mistaken for each other, and you can see in the picture here how close they resemble each other in size as well. So these obviously are not drawn to scale. The Atlantic sturgeon could be 15 feet long. Shad are typically less than 2 feet, but over, say, 16 inches. And the alewives are more in the 10-inch size range. So there's various ways to recover the rivers, and you've seen this maybe in the news, or you've been around it and read about it or seen it yourselves. Stocking fish is what's being done with Atlantic salmon. The Atlantic salmon is on death's doorstep. They're near extinction, and we've had to intervene. And that is intervention by bringing them out of the wild into the hatchery, therefore protecting them in order to get eggs and to produce a population. This has been done with California condors, for example, successfully. They had to take a drastic measure. In that case, they took all the condors into captivity and then began to breed them and look at the genetics and all these things, and then put them back out. And that's what's been going on with Atlantic salmon for a very long time, and we're continuing to perfect that method. And our hatcheries are experimental and showing very positive results. So we've been changing the way in which we're doing that. Before, I wanted to just kind of understand the group and the people present to know I didn't want to show a lot of pretty pictures of rivers. I could do that, or smiling kids at a river, and we do all of those things because we produce a lot of happy people with our work. We're putting on a smelt fry. Please mark your calendars, April 27th. And in fact, we're catching the smelts tonight. But to have a conversation with you all about, in your particular circumstance, what questions do you have about how this might be possible to see recovery in your river? And before I go there, I just want to say that we're very fortunate in the state of Maine that all of these species are still present. So it's not like the passenger pigeon. We're not bringing the passenger pigeon back, but we still have a chance to recover these species. And some rivers have all of the full suite, and other rivers are really quite depleted and are starting from a very base level of trying to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. So dams are held typically by private parties. Some dams are held by towns, some are held by water districts, or some are producing power. But there are many thousands of dams, tens of thousands of dams in New England that had historic function and are no longer being used for those initial, those early functions, whether it was grinding corn or any number of other things. So it's really aging infrastructure is what we're looking at oftentimes. And if you're going to put money into something old, you want to make sure that it's at least stable. And what we find with dams is you may have to stabilize it first before you can invest any money in putting a fishway, say, into it. And of course, this is substantial amounts of money. We're rebuilding a dam now that we think will cost somewhere around $4 to $5 million. It's 200 feet long, it's 20 feet tall, and it's almost 200 years old. and it hasn't had a fishway for 90 years. In the 1860s, it was an experimental site where it was proven that a river without a fishway could get a fishway and then find itself producing fish again. But over time, the fishway deteriorated and it was never rebuilt. So it's this particular case been there for 90 years without fish passage. So I do have other slides. I could show you slides of what it looks like to take a dam out with a big piece of yellow equipment and a picture of a hatchery and some statistics. But I think with the time that we have, I'd like to at least open questions and see if maybe some of those, if need be, I could show you additional photos just to give you an example. But Andy, is that okay with you if we move into
Yes.
questions based on?
Yeah, it's definitely fine with us. If you would like to remove the share screen, that will give everybody a better gallery view of all the folks that are here. If any of you have a question, you can, and you're using video, you can simply raise your hand. If you're using audio only, you can use the raise hand icon that Zoom provides. I see one question first from Corinne. Would you please ask Dwayne your question?
Oh,
And take
you're on
yourself
mute.
off mute.
Muted.
Okay,
There you go.
thank you for your work. Are the anglers still involved?
Very much so.
Great,
Almost everyone involved we're much more diverse than we once were, which is great. So, but we're keeping our sort of cultural traditions and the culture of the organization alive. Yes.
great. And oh, where did it go? So the alewives and the blueback will come recolonize fast.
Typically that's the case. And if you, I'm not sure if any of you have actually seen alewives down below the dam or not. What we found on the Orange River at this dam, no fish passage in 90 years. There was a man with his 3 sons who used to dip them up and over for years and years. Kids grew up, they moved away. And that came to an end, but that was 40 years ago, probably. But those fish are there's still alewives below that dam and kind of poking in, exploring. So yes, however, you could conceivably move some in. It takes certain permits to do that, and we're looking at doing that in some cases as well. And the premise there is that first you have to show that you're actually going to get fish passage in, so that nobody has to dip the fish up and over every single year.
I see Jeffrey's hand up.
Okay,
All right, Jeffrey, would you like to ask your question?
So I'm sorry I can't have my picture on. I don't have the bandwidth today. But nice to see you, Dwayne. I appreciate all the work you've done. I was curious as to why you don't have Manhattan on that list. Just out of curiosity.
Sure. They spawn in the salt water, or maybe not quite 100% salinity, but the others require no salinity or very, very low salinity.
So is
they're not considered diadromous.
Is that part of why they're up in the harbors so much?
Well, they're more likely feeding. They may be spawning there as well, but you won't see them going up inside the rivers.
I guess I was, oh man, it must be close to 35 years ago when I was lobstering. I used to dip alewives in the Passy, in that little narrow passage that goes up under the bridge.
Hmm.
I haven't tried it for a long time, but I always thought that was curious because there is a dam up there, not very far up.
Right. Yeah, they can spawn below those dams, and this is some of the research that's been done recently. In fact, we went to Woods Hole and met with some researchers there that have the capability of looking at the carbon. So fish are made of carbon too. So here's one good thing that we're doing for the environment is to put some of that carbon into fish. So like we put it into trees or soil or what have you. And they could trace that carbon signature back to a river and or a bay, and they could tell, in fact, if the fish had ever been in fresh water. So alewives and I don't know about bluebacks so much, but alewives do have some capacity to live their entire life in salt water. So they could spawn in a very brackish situation and then come up to maturity and migrate out to the ocean in brackish water. So we were able to show this in the Penobscot River, for instance. The long estuary of the Penobscot. I live over near Hog Bay in Franklin, and there's a lot of herring, small herring that are river herring out there in that low salinity. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Sid, your question?
Yes, I apologize for having missed the beginning of your talk. So I have a couple of questions, one of which you may have already talked about, and that is, I'm talking more specifically about the two dams that are on the Little River, which are the ones that are at the heart of the current part of the controversy here in Belfast. And my first question is, if it were to come to either restore or remove those dams, are you aware of funding that could be used for that purpose? So that's my first question.
Mm-hmm. Funding for dam removal is very easy to secure. In NOAA fisheries, we've got a number of grants that we're managing right now from NOAA fisheries, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and others. So it is a very high priority with these fisheries agencies to open these systems back up again, whether it's for fishways or dam removal, but especially dam removals. It's quite easy to fund. And that's, of course, assuming there are no toxic issues there and things like that. But even in that case, if there were contaminated sediments, for instance, there are ways to address that too.
So second question is, if you were to remove those, you're familiar with the Little River?
I am, yeah.
Okay, if you were to remove those dams, what would you expect to occur along the Little River?
Well, first the pond behind them would turn into a river. So that's what's creating the pond. And then you'd immediately see vegetation spring up in those sediments along what was the pond bottom. And you would see a stream channel begin to re-scour its historic location. And if there were sediment built up behind those dams over the 100 years or what have you it's been, that sediment would get mobilized and go where it was originally intending to go, down onto the clam flats. So you can proactively go in and plant trees along the stream if you chose to do that. You let it make its way through the succession with different plants that would come in there. You definitely want to avoid having invasive plants take over. So you'd be keeping an eye on that. Of course, the fish species would begin to return, and you could monitor that ideally we like to do pre and post monitoring to know what effect we've had. The water quality would improve in terms of the temperature, so it wouldn't be sitting stagnant, so to speak. It's not quite stagnant because it's a river running through it, but so you'd see a change there. And those species that like ponds wouldn't do well, most likely. There may be historically have been some amount of a pond there behind, say, a naturally occurring ledge. Often what we find is that the ledges have also been altered over time, because of course there were probably dams there before these dams. So you might see, in fact, that there's an old dam underneath there that most likely was breached, but its wings may now be an interesting feature that could stay or could be turned into a walkway or something like that.
One of the things that's occurred, of course, over the many years that the two dams that are there have existed, is that there's kind of an ecosystem that's developed. Beaver, otter, a number of other species which we've seen. And so I guess one question is it a viable alternative to have the dams with some sort of fish ladders, or is that just not, and sort of maintain what's there in terms of the reservoirs and the walking trails and things like that?
Mm-hmm. It is, and in terms of, like I said, I'm sitting here in this office. We have a desk right behind me and Corinne sits here, and she's been taking pictures of beaver and otter and all kinds of animals out here in what was a pond at one time. And now there's birch trees growing there and so on, and tons of smelts just below it because of the dam removal. So it wouldn't necessarily affect the beaver and otter that much. They're adapted for that. But in terms of, can you build a fishway, or you certainly could. It's expensive, and then you have to get into the structural integrity of what you're building it into. So you have a dam there that's maybe of questionable structural integrity, or its maintenance has been deferred for a long time, and so you'd first have to address that before you'd want to invest a lot of money in a fishway.
Yep. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, our next question will come from Lauren and then Galen. So Lauren, your question? And yeah.
Thanks, Dwayne. I have a question. I know globally that actually dams and hydropower are being really pushed as climate change solutions. If you look at like the COP discussions internationally, they're trying to double the amount of dams on the earth right now as a hydropower solution, or as a climate change solution. There's a lot of problems with that. Mostly, well, both environmentally and also that the dams are being built on indigenous territory. But do you see that in Maine? Like, do you get that story too, that we should have more dams? Or how do you feel that the work you're doing and like the landscape of Maine is tied into that global push for more dams?
Yeah, this is my entire adult life. I've been in this conversation. In fact, I've been a fisheries biologist. That's what I studied, in river fisheries. And the building we're sitting in was a dam site since the 1700s, on and off various dams. And when there was the energy crisis in the 70s and 80s, the dam was rebuilt completely to generate power. And the idea is we need fast track permitting to go ahead and build dams, and because we needed renewable energy. But all of those considerations, so that continues to come up all the time. And there are efforts to build fish-friendly hydro, and this has been a technological, we can put a person on the moon, but we haven't figured that out yet, really. And there's efforts underway to do that. In Maine, we have a lot of old dams. They're being kept in place often, large dams that are licensed under federal law, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, but largely owned by one company. So about 90% of the power generation in Maine is owned and produced by a company from Toronto, which is an international massive corporation that has dams in other places and other types of real estate. But I guess what you point out is a bit of a fallacy that exists, that hydro is green. And while it is renewable, yes, it may not be what you might strictly consider green, because it produces a heck of a lot of methane.
Mhm.
So those impoundments, and when you walk in the mud of a pond, you see these bubbles come up, right? That's methane coming out, and it's typically in more stagnant water. So if you take and build a huge reservoir over soils that are full of carbon, which most soils are, it will turn to methane and bubble out and end up in the atmosphere. So that's being looked at pretty closely now. In fact, there's an article being written by Bloomberg News. They called me last week on this topic. They're out of Toronto themselves. So the Hydro-Quebec, which is generating a lot of renewable energy that's being shipped down through Maine to fill the needs of what is considered renewable energy requirements in Massachusetts law, is maybe not as green as we would hope because of the methane, because of the impacts on the Cree Indians and others up there who have fought against it to begin with. So there is constantly that refrain, always. If you talk about a dam, someone will say, shouldn't you be generating electricity there? Well, it's not viable at certain scales. The market just doesn't exist, first and foremost, for the technology. And we've been around that many, many times. And it's always part of the conversation.
Thanks.
Galen, do you have a question? And please take yourself off mute.
Yes, thank you, Dwayne. Could you teach us or tell us something about the shad fishery in the 1900s in Maine, and what part of the Andromeda's fish, food supply that was, and is there any shad fishery restoration today in Maine?
Yeah, I love this story, and there's a book that's called The Founding Fish, and written by John McPhee. It's famous author. Have you seen it? It's an amazing, yes. And these were the poor man's salmon. They were so numerous, and culturally important, and kept people alive for, of course, thousands of years. And they're big, delicious fish. And the roe is particularly savored in the Chesapeake and other places where there's substantial shad fishery. Well, back to Humpty Dumpty again, here in Maine, the Penobscot River had several dams removed. Before those dams were removed, lower stem, large dams, there'd been fish traps on those dams, fishways that worked marginally well, better for salmon than for shad. And shad are pretty finicky when it comes to getting into narrow spaces and going around corners in the dark and these ladders and so on. So for some, I forget what the statistics are, something like 30 years, they'd had 150 shad come up through these fishways. They removed the dams. Now, I think it's less than 20 years ago. I believe they had about 8,000 shad last year. And that's just the beginning. So the ramp up is really tremendous. And they're sport fish as well. So I fish for them on the Narraguagas here in Cherryfield. And I keep a few a year and put them in my smokehouse, and they're just really amazing. So yeah, the potential to, another refrain that you will hear is the oceans are dead. They're never coming back. We've got to farm the oceans, and that's like giving up. And it's a lot of malarkey, and it's let's go ahead and privatize the oceans because we failed so miserably to manage our wild fish. Well, if you look at the Penobscot and those 8,000 shad, that's just the beginning. The 4 or 5 million alewives that weren't there before the dam removal, I mean, maybe more than that, might be 10 million now. That's just the beginning. Every one of those fish is edible, and they're low in the food web, so they don't accumulate a lot of toxins. So there's a lot of reasons why we should be doing this, and we are doing it. It can be done. I see another question.
So, I was interested that the money for dam removal is kind of, you said it was pretty easy to get. And you said, from NOAA and the US wildlife fisheries.
Yeah.
And, are those people not talking to the aquaculture people? So that, like, it seems like the aquaculture federal people are just saying aquaculture, 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 as opposed to listening to the possibility of restoration.
Mhm.
And so are they not talking to each other as far as you know?
The tail's wagging the dog is what I've said. So Congress is under pressure to move toward this farming approach, and it's at massive industrial scale. It's at and all the way down the continuum, but
Under pressure from who?
capital
Okay,
invest. This is big money investment in massive infrastructure placed in the ocean to raise fish.
okay.
And the excuse, I'm not saying I'm completely opposed to any of this, but or some of it, is that the oceans are dead. We have to feed all these 10 billion people on the planet, and the only way we're going to do it is by farming, and it just ain't true. And the percentage perhaps should grow, and there should be aquaculture, certainly some amounts of it, but it's all the details that matter. But what we should never do is give up on the wild fish and put privatize aquaculture in front of wild fish recovery, in my humble opinion. And in every town, there's a lot of water, and if it's mismanaged, you get a big goose egg out of it. And that's what we need to be thinking about, is how many millions of alewives can we be producing in the state of Maine alone? And it's not millions, it's actually billions. And one of the slides that I show in some of my presentations is a bottle of rum. And I say, well, it was rum that kept the loggers going. It was rum that kept the, production moving on the ships and so on and so forth. Where did it come from? It came from the Caribbean. It came from people that were enslaved, and those enslaved people needed to be fed. what's the most prolific thing that you can feed to a load of people to produce your rum? Alewives. And we were sending shiploads of alewives out of this state and out of many other places, and cod, of course, and other things. But alewives were a really big thing. And then we'd get the rum back. So the part of that is we could be feeding Haiti right now with the alewives, that if we wanted a sister city relationship or whatever, no doubt. And it's a great example because the people in Haiti still know how to eat alewives. It's still been an ongoing thing since that period. There's a few companies in Canada who come to Maine, buy alewives, smoke them and salt them, and send them to Haiti. And when that earthquake happened there some years back, when there was no refrigeration, and even when there was refrigeration, the market was there, but it really went up after that earthquake. It's good protein and shelf stable and all of that. People locally, the only people locally who eat it are people in their 70s and older, typically, because they remember eating these fish. And so part of what we have to do is teach people how to eat fish with bones in them, because the average person's never even seen a fish with a head on it.
I believe Ellie has a question.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
We can.
Oh, good. Thanks so much, Dwayne. I really, I'm so in awe of how much you've accomplished. I wonder if you could sort of talk a little bit about the broader picture of aquaculture, because it tends to get lumped into one pot, like it's all the same. And if you could talk about the difference between fin fish and small fish like a tilapia and on land and net pen, and then the common aquaculture, sustainable aquaculture that we think about in Maine of mussels and scallops and oysters and kelp.
Right.
Because I think that we really need more available language to talk to other people about this. If you could talk about that.
Yeah, thank you. I can talk longer than you can listen, as somebody said. It's aquaculture. When you go and buy a gallon of milk and you look at the label and there's a picture of a silo and a little girl milking a cow and all of that, that's nice. It's the marketing, you know, it's the way in which some very large companies can sometimes hide behind a tiny, this myth of what actually is going on. So it's the same with aquaculture, and it's at every scale. It's organic, small operators doing things that there's, what's the term? I'm a little tired, sorry. Very artisanal and value added at the local most level in appropriate scales. And then there's the really, really big end, the other end, where most of the mangrove swamps in large swaths of the world have been mown down and turned into shrimp farms. So you talk about an ecosystem that is productive, and to replace it with a shrimp farm is just questionable, let's say. So the scales matter, the species matter, the energy inputs matter in who's, the state of Maine, the legislature is wrestling with a number of bills right now, I believe, and they have for at least 25 years, maybe more like 30 or more now, about scale. Where is it appropriate? how much should we allow? How much owned by one particular company? Will it become
Mhm.
consolidated and you know, a monopoly? So there's been a lot of thought put into this, but not nearly enough really to prevent some pretty disastrous things that we've seen in Maine. So the fish that eat other fish are dependent upon a wild fishery, which is taking forage fish out of the oceans, fish that would feed other natural predators, and turning them into meal, fish meal. And this is what happened with menhaden. So our ecosystem is so altered by virtue of a menhaden fishery that was derived to produce oils and meal, not necessarily for aquaculture back in those days, but for other purposes. And when you take that massive amount of biomass as what are keystone species, everything else will crumble when you start to take those apart. So alewives are an example. You remove them by damming up all the rivers. You remove all the menhaden by consolidating it and allowing for a monopoly to exist that just vacuums the ocean of that particular species. And pretty soon the ecosystem collapses. And enough generations go by that people forget what once was there and what is possible. So the history is super important. Aquaculture is taking all kinds of sizes and shapes. There's a lot of innovation going on. There's a lot of research and development money coming in from Congress and from the state of Maine even and I've been involved with a lot of research projects trying to raise sea scallops, raising oysters, raising clams. I was a shellfish biologist before I got full-time into sea-run fish work. And I've traveled around the world quite a bit, actually, looking at a variety of different types of aquaculture. So it's very diverse and includes freshwater. That's of course, catfish in the United States are the biggest example of that. Bait fish aquaculture for like ice fishing and things like that. Crayfish, of course, south. So our aquatic ecosystems where this takes place, the unusual thing about aquaculture is that it takes place often in the commons. So the commons are the place that we all are own, and it's there to benefit so-called the commonwealth of, and that's the water. So you can't own it, but you can lease it, or you can get a license to dam it, and so on and so forth, and therefore privatize it. So when you make that, when you go down that fork in the road and you say, okay, we're going this direction, we're going to privatize this, it does restrict public uses. And so shellfish may seem a little more innocuous, but at scale or at inappropriate scales, they could be absorbing a lot of the plankton out of a particular bay where the wild shellfish might suffer as a result. So these are big questions to try to understand and answer on a place-by-place approach. Bay planning is part of what's talked about with aquaculture. So one size fits all across the state of Maine might not work necessarily in Frenchman Bay versus Casco. I'm sure I only touched on a few things that might be on your mind about that, but it's a huge topic. It's like asking the question, what do you think about agriculture, right? Or explain agriculture. It's huge and it's really growing fast, and it's only going to grow faster than what we've seen.
But if I'm hearing you correctly, the most important thing you mentioned several times was scale
Absolutely.
and,
Scale
and balance.
and right, and appropriateness of what's, you can let the cat out of the bag, so to speak. So Atlantic salmon are being farmed. It's the biggest aquaculture industry in the state. About 600 acres out of 1,600 that are leased, I believe. And it's owned by one company, and they're at the limit of, I think, the growth that they're allowed. I'm not 100% sure of that. But at one time, they were raising fish with non-native genes. So
Mhm.
they're bringing in fish from Europe, and they're domesticating what is a wild fish. And if you remember, or you can think about what happened with turkeys. So a wild turkey is very different than a domestic turkey. One can't find its way out of a box, and the other one takes some skill to track down and hunt. So they're creating a domesticated animal, and if they get out and then they interbreed with the wild ones, you're essentially dumbing down your wild fish.
Dwayne, as the hour comes to the close, on behalf of the Friends of the Harriet L. Hartley Conservation Area, I'd like to applaud your talk and thank you so much for speaking with us, and hope that we might count on you in the future again to continue to educate us. Are there any other questions? Dwayne, do you have any final comments?
Well, no, thank you again. Keep up the good work down there and care for your place. And I'd be happy to come down and talk again or do another Zoom. Please consider supporting what we're doing up here. Downeast Salmon Federation, we have a website and all of that. And consider coming to our smelt fry. We call it a celebration of sustainable wild fisheries. So,
Andy, put that on our website. Thank you, Dwayne.
We will definitely do that. And thank you, Wayne. Thank you
Thank
all
you.
for listening today. And our next speaker in April will be Ralph Olson, who is, I think, the executive director of Friends of Sears Island. So we are going to get an update on the situation surrounding Sears Island as the governor's selection for the offshore wind port. And it'll be very interesting to hear what Rolf's opinion is of that and how we might usefully oppose the dear governor and try and get her to pick Mac Point. So we'll see you all in April for that session. Thanks again.